waves of thunderous applause. Let me ask one favor, and that is we're going to be having a book signing out in the front hall at the end of this, and I'd like to ask everyone to stay in the room until Ambassador Ross has had the chance to leave and get in position at the table where books will be available for purchase, and he will be glad to sign. Dennis Ross, thank you so much for your extraordinary contribution. Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Okay, class is dismissed.
You're too kind.
We're going to have to ask for lunch.
Yes,
Oh, great. Thank you so much for that.
Oh, very good. I got a lot more, but I didn't want to comment.
It's all fun.
It's a long history.
Four veteran TV reporters talk about covering the assassination of John F. Kennedy, as told in their book, When the News Went Live, Dallas, 1963. See it tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
He's best known for co-authoring the controversial book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And live this Sunday at noon Eastern, it's your chance to talk to Charles Murray on Book TV's In Depth. Mr. Murray, the author of 8 books and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, has written about welfare reform in Losing Ground, American Social Policy, 1950 to 1980, on what it means to be a libertarian, and his latest, Human Accomplishment, the Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950. Charles Murray, In Depth, live this Sunday at noon Eastern on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Sunday on Afterwards, Essie Mae Washington Williams on her Dear Senator, a memoir by the daughter of Strom Thurmond. Our guest interviewer is Tennessee Congressman Harold Ford Jr. Afterwards, every Sunday at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Now Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Every weekend, we bring you 48 hours of nonfiction books, history, biography, and public affairs, Saturday morning at 8 through Monday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern.
Now a panel on poetry for children with the Weekly Standard's Joseph Bottum and William Crystal, National Endowment for the Arts Chairman Dana Gioia, Vanity Fair columnist Christopher Hitchens, and author Mary Eberstadt. It's an hour 20 minutes.
Welcome. How are you all? Great to see you. My name is Michael Novak. I'm the George Frederick Jewett Chair here at AEI, and I'm privileged to welcome you for, I don't know, the 8th or 9th or 10th of our little cultural series. These are not official events of AEI, but the President does allow us to use the rooms and put them on, and we finance it ourselves. So our sponsors needn't worry that we're not using their great contributions for non-public policy matters. But we are using them for matters more important than public policy. And I'm really thrilled and honored that Jody Bottum agreed to put together this stellar panel for a reading of children's poetry so that we could invite the next generation and the next generation to be here with us and enjoy this evening. I'll turn it over to Jody for the introductions, and I think we're going to have a really, really good time. Jody, please. Thanks.
Today's This program came about because writers will do anything, absolutely anything, to avoid keeping a promise. Last summer, I took an advance to write a new book on, thanks. I took an advance to write a new book on the state of Catholicism in America. So naturally, I had to find something else to do and some way of avoiding actually doing that. And the best thing I could come up with was to spend the next 3 or 4 months writing some children's poems. And when I mentioned to our friend Michael Novak that my new manuscript was children's poetry, he suggested that I put together a panel of people here in Washington to read their favorites and to natter a little bit about what children's poetry is and what it's for and what we should be looking for in it. Now, you have to understand the nation's capital is famous for many things, but comic children's poetry really isn't one of them. In fact, poetry at all isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Washington, D.C., although the comic children part might. Anyway, there were no obvious choices here in town, so I asked the next 6 people to whom I happen to owe an email to join me today and read and talk a little bit about children's verse, and because God really does look out for idiots like me, we ended up with this unbelievable panel of people. My name is Joseph Bottum, and I'm the literary editor of the Weekly Standard and poetry editor of a magazine up in New York called First Things. Our friend Christopher Buckley, who was supposed to be here today, was unfortunately called away, but we still have Dana Gioia, who's the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts and a celebrated poet and critic, whose latest volume is Disappearing Ink, right? Poetry at the end of the print culture. Our second, we have Christopher Hitchens, a widely published essayist, columnist for Vanity Fair, and the Atlantic Monthly, and everywhere else, and author most recently of Love, Poverty, and War, Journeys and Essays. Next, we have Tim Kelleher, who's an actor, writer, and director in Los Angeles and New York, whose film credits include the role of Ted Sorensen in Roger Donaldson's movie 13 Days, and perhaps more to the point, the voice of Raphael in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We have William Crystal, my boss, the editor of the Weekly Standard, and a well-known political commentator for national television, writer everywhere. And finally, Mary Eberstadt, who's a consulting editor to the magazine Policy Review and author of the phenomenal new book, Home Alone America, The Hidden Toll of Daycare, Behavioral Drugs, and Other Parent Substitutes. Now, I'm going to start us off with a poem from my new manuscript because, well, mostly because I set up this panel and it's mine, all mine. No, but also because one of the things that we can talk about a little when we natter here today is how much of children's poetry is not for children at all. Or maybe what I mean is that a lot of children's poems run on 2 levels at the same time. There's the bounce, the tum-ti-da-tum, and the speed and the nonsense that children love. And at the same time, there's a joke in them for adults. Now, maybe this has to be so because you need to get parents actually to read those poems to the children. You should always remember the fact that publishers have never forgotten, a fact which publishers have never forgotten, which is it's the parents who buy the books, not the children. But there's also a deeper reason, maybe, for why so much children's poetry wants to have a second level that appeals to adults. Anyway, this poem of mine is called Reading by Osmosis. And it's for my many friends, both young and old, who know the names of many, many more authors and books than they've ever actually read. And it's called Reading by Osmosis, and it goes, well, Mark Twain, Hart Crane, and Ursula K. Le Guin. We've mastered their books with a difficult trick. We've read them outside in. Percy B. Shelley and Machiavelli and Norman Vincent Peale. We've never tried opening one of their books. We know them by their feel. Does reading seem boring? Does reading seem hard? Does reading seem too ferocious? Then pick up a book and just give it a twirl. You'll learn it by osmosis, because osmosis is the mostest, osmosis is the best, osmosis is the closest thing to reading without rest. Osmosis means absorbing, osmosis means so much. Osmosis means we're soaking up the books we barely touch. Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Henry David Thoreau, and Daniel Defoe, and Jacques Rousseau, and hundreds of others we know. We bobble, bounce, and throw them. We never even look. Osmosis means we know them without opening a book. You know, my sister osmoted The Mill on the Floss. a marvelous book, and gave us a gloss concerning a man named John Stuart Mill with terrible teeth that made him quite ill. Why, oh why, wouldn't he floss? My brother Osmoded The Lord of the Rings, a story of insects with thousands of wings. Or was that a book called Lord of the Flies? Oh, well, we're getting wise by learning the things that osmosis now brings. We'll juggle the books Little Women and Men, they're all about dwarves in a mountainy den, and throw in a copy of Watership Down, concerning a boat and some sailors who drown, and then we'll run to the bookstore again. But first, let's have a word from Dr. Derzena, who comes here today all the way from Vienna to teach us the meaning of difficult things. Ach, well, now we begin. Osmosis, this is meaning that when two things are leaning, the one into the other tries to sneak. The liquid on the right, through membranes overnight, will to the left most definitely leak. While coming here I sat, on dictionaries fought, and learned all this by writing on the book. But if you have neurosis, mein genius is hypnosis. You will mine eyes most deeply into look. Neurosis, hypnosis, psychosis, meiosis, lovely words in their way. Cirrhosis, necrosis, and also thrombosis, pleasing but harder to say. And atrocious prognosis of misdiagnosis for aches of precocious sclerosis. But words will find their apotheosis remains the great osmosis we boast. We boast. Osmosis is the most phenomenal way to read today while eating jam and toast. We shout, we plead, osmosis we will need for playing jacks and munching snacks and dancing while we read. So, Rebecca West and Edgar Guest, we'll never be certain which one is the best. Christopher Smart and Jean-Paul Sartre, just think of the wonders they have to impart. Poets of genius like Julia Moore and William McGonagall call for a roar. William Shakespeare, Edward de Vere. The difference isn't entirely clear. Somerset Maugham and L. Frank Baum, Josiah Royce and James Joyce, John Bunyan and Damon Runyon, Graham Greene and Molly Keane, Tom Paine and Ed McBain, Ring Lardner and John Gardner, C.P. Snow and Arthur Rimbaud, and hundreds of others we know, because osmosis is the mostest. Osmosis is the best. Osmosis is the closest thing to reading without rest. Osmosis means absorbing. Osmosis means so much. Osmosis means we're soaking up the books we barely touch. We hold them to our noses. We brush them with our clothes. We're learning by osmosis when we tap them with our toes. We pile them on the table. We slide them on the floor. We stack them into stairways and we climb up for some more. We bobble, bounce, and throw them. We never even look. Osmosis means we know them without opening a book.
Well, since Jody recited a poem that danced, I'll do one that tells a story. It seems to me that people that really love poetry almost always learn to love poetry as children. And there's something about the experience of actually hearing a poem before you can read a poem on a page, which I think is much closer to what the experience of poetry really is, which is about speech raised to a level that it's memorable and expressive. This is a poem that probably most of you don't know. It's by a very famous poet, A.E. Housman. And he wrote poems in letters that he sent to his nephew and his niece that were never included in his collected poems, but they're rather good. This one also has something I think that's very important for children's poetry, which is disruptive and slightly subversive energy. It's called Inhuman Henry, or Cruelty to Fabulous Animals. Oh, would you know why Henry sleeps, and why his mourning mother weeps, and why his weeping mother mourns? He was unkind to unicorns. No unicorn with Henry's leave could dance upon the lawn at eve, or gore the gardener's boy in spring, or do the very slightest thing. No unicorn could safely roar, or dash its nose against the door, nor sit in peace upon the mat to eat the dog or drink the cat. Henry would never in the least encourage the heraldic beast. If there were unicorns about, he went and let the lion out. The lion leaping from its chain and glaring through its tangled mane would stand on end and bark and bound and bite what unicorns it found. And when the lion bit a lot, was Henry sorry? He was not. What did his jumps of joy betoken? Joy. He was a very bloody-minded boy. The unicorn is not a goose, and when it sees a lion loose, they grew increasingly aware that they had better not be there. And oh, the unicorn is fleet, and spurns the earth with all its feet. The lion had to snap and snatch at tips of tails it could not catch. Returning home in temper bad, it met the sanguinary lad, and clasping Henry with its claws, it took his legs between his jaws. Down, lion, down, said Henry, cease. My legs immediately release. His formidable feline pet made no reply, but only ate. The last words that were ever said by Henry's disappearing head in accents of indignant scorn were, I am not a unicorn. And now you know why Henry sleeps, and why his mother mourns and weeps, and why she also weeps and mourns. So now be kind to unicorns. Yes.
Ladies and gentlemen, yes, that's good. You see before you, in the empurpled nose that looks as if a door has been slammed on it, or as if it's stopped a fist in a fight, the nose of a father who went sledding neither wisely nor too well in a frozen Washington this weekend. When I was small, I was made to listen to a lot of hymn tunes. I think my childhood otherwise was rather prosaic. But when I began to feel that I had some ear for poetry, it was in the ear. It was the feeling that if it was poetry, it would be memorized, or could be memorized, and that this was the oral tradition, extending backwards to Homer. And I became almost dogmatic about it. If you can't memorize it, it probably isn't a very good poem. At a school which my father later helped to run, there was a poetry competition every year for the boys, and it was called a poetry saying competition, which I thought was very well put. The poetry saying would be held. And an old boy of the school, Cecil Day Lewis, used to come and judge the poetry saying, and he became the first person I ever asked shyly to sign a book for me, and I have it still. But that might be too grave an introduction to what I propose to recite, which is a piece of nonsense from Lewis Carroll, the Reverend Dodgson. This is in the same city of Oxford, as I have this signature from Day Lewis. Jody and I once, he just reminded me, discussed why it was that just about the time the French invented surrealism, the English came up with nonsense. This may have been the opening of a longer battle than we know. At any rate, some of you will recognize at least some of it when I say, "'Twas brillig, and the slithy tove stood gyre and gimble in the wabe. All mimsy were the borogoves, and the momraths outgrabe. Beware the Jabberwock, my son, the jaws that bite, the teeth that catch. Beware the jub-jub bird, and shun the frumnius bandersnatch. He took his vorpal sword in hand, long time the manxome foe he sought. Then rested he by the tum-tum tree, and stood a while in thought, and as in uffish thought he stood, the Jabberwock, with eyes of flame, came whiffling through the tulgey wood, and burbled as it came. 1, 2, 1, 2, and through the vorpal blade went snicker-snack. He left it dead, and with its head he went galumphing back. And hast thou slain the Jabberwock? Come to my arms, my beamish boy. O frabjous day, calloo, callay, he chortled in his joy. 'Twas brillig and the slithy toves, did gyre and gimble in the wabe, all mimsy were the borogoves, and the murmuraths our grave. Voila.
Hello. Before we go a step further, I have to look into the camera and tell my niece, Jennifer, the unicorn is okay. Don't worry about a thing. She has a great collection and affection for unicorns. I guess we're all here because poetry has come to mean a great deal to all of us in some fashion. I think I speak for everyone. Mr. Crystal?
Tell by his magazine.
But contrary to Mr. Joya, I didn't like poetry very much when I was growing up. And it wasn't until I was at least well into college that I actually started enjoying poetry because I started writing poems, not knowing a thing about how it was done. And I guess I caught Jody napping one day because he agreed to publish one of them. I'm going to read, the first poem I'm going to read is from Jody's collection. And I think it's obvious why. Robert and Martha and sweet little Joe, sweet, sweet Joe, were the pleasantest children that you'll ever know. Robert and Martha and Joe. They picked up their toys, they ate all their peas, they never made noise, they always said, please. Each was a precious and wonderful jewel, while sometimes they even left early for school. But once they got outside, they kicked a neighbor's cat, they stole a baby's hat, and they tripped old Mr. Johnson so he fell down with a splat. Then Martha punched the boy so Joe could grab his toy, while young Robert looked for something he could easily destroy. To students, they were rude. In their classes, they were booed, and they broke into the lunchroom to add pepper to the food. They sang off-key in choir, and they slashed their teacher's tire, and while walking home that afternoon, they set a church on fire. Oh, Robert and Martha and sweet little Joe, sweet, sweet Joe. They were the awfulest children that you'll ever know. Robert and Martha and Joe. So, red sky at morning, parents, take warning. Red sky at night, parents, take fright. Keep children happy, clean, and I shout, never ever let them go out.
Those games or puzzles where there are those lists and you're supposed to pick out, this is I think also on tests on SATs, who or what doesn't fit in this list. I feel that this is my role up here is to make everyone else look good, which I'm happy to do. That's right, Jody asked me to come. No, but it's an honor to be here with published poets, and memorizers of poetry, and appreciators, sophisticated appreciators of poetry, and then there's me. I actually, I know poetry, children's poetry is supposed to be read to children to amuse them or entertain them or educate them. I didn't read very much poetry to our kids, and when I did, it was mostly to get them to go to sleep. And therefore, I read to them up to the age of 5. So I thought I would begin. I want to say one more thing about the kids. I mean, it is actually a pleasure to be here and such distinguished people, but I must say I didn't realize I'd be sitting next to Tim, who, in addition to his other achievements, but most importantly, of course, is the voice of one of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, which is, I mean, I've sat next to many people at AAI panels, but this is by far the one I'm most impressed by, I want to say. And my kids would be, too, I'm sure. Anyway, I thought I would read begin with two very short picture books, which are familiar to most of you, which we actually did read to our kids, and which they retain snatches of, and I retain snatches of. The first is by Sandra Boynton, most famous for her excellent but not the hippopotamus. But I won't read you that. I'll read you the Going to Bed book, consistent with my theme here of putting people to sleep. We'll see if all the little kids nod off here in the next 2 minutes. It's a picture book, so I can't really make up for the excellent illustrations. But this is called the Going to Bed book. The sun has set not long ago. Now everybody goes below to take a bath in one big tub with soap all over. Scrub, scrub, scrub. They hang their towels on the wall and find pajamas, big and small. With some on top and some beneath, they brush and brush and brush their teeth. And when the moon is on the rise, they all go up to exercise. And down once more, but not so fast, they're on their way to bed at last. The day is done, they say goodnight, and somebody turns off the light. The moon is high, the sea is deep. They rock and rock and rock to sleep. It's the Going to Bed book. I should have probably explained before I began that these are animals on a ship, you know, on a kind of cruise ship, sort of like the one that the Weekly Standard is going on in 2 weeks. Maybe I'll bring this on the cruise. And the second is also short, very famous Goodnight Moon by Margaret Wise Brown. In the great green room, there was a telephone and a red balloon and a picture of the cow jumping over the moon. And there were 3 little bears sitting on chairs, and 2 little kittens, and a pair of mittens, and a little toy house, and a young mouse, and a comb, and a brush, and a bowl full of mush, and a quiet old lady who was whispering, hush. Good night, room. Good night, moon. Good night, cow jumping over the moon. Good night, light and the red balloon. Good night, bears. Good night, chairs. Good night, kittens, and good night, mittens. Good night, clocks, and good night, socks. Good night, little house, and good night, mouse. Good night, comb, and good night, brush. Good night, nobody. Good night, mush. And good night to the old lady, whispering hush. Good night, stars. Good night, air. Good night, noises everywhere.
Well, I feel a little like Bill here. As best I can tell, I'm here for one of 2 reasons, neither particularly elevated. One, because Jody's my friend and he's allowing me to shamelessly exploit the occasion to mention my new book, Home Alone America. And the other, even more politically incorrect reason is that it was my great good fortune to marry well, and in particular to marry Nicholas Nash Eberstadt, who is the grandson of Ogden Nash, and which is to say Ogden Nash's poetry is fairly well known in our household. And I thought I would start by reading one called The Adventures of Isabel. Ogden Nash had 2 daughters, Linnell and Isabel. Isabel is Nick's mother, and there is also an Isabel sitting in the back who is our Isabel, and I would like to read this for her. Isabel met an enormous bear. Isabel didn't care. The bear was hungry. The bear was ravenous. The bear's big mouth was cruel and cavernous. The bear said, Isabel, glad to meet you. How do, Isabel? Now I'll eat you. Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She washed her hands and she straightened her hair up, and Isabel quietly ate the bear up. Once in a night as black as pitch, Isabel met a wicked old witch. The witch's face was cross and wrinkled. The witch's gums with teeth were sprinkled. Ho, ho, Isabel, the old witch crowed. I'll turn you into an ugly toad. Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She showed no rage and she showed no rancor, but she turned the witch into milk and drank her. Isabel met a hideous giant. Isabel continued self-reliant. The giant was hairy. The giant was horrid. He had one eye in the middle of his forehead. Good morning, Isabel, the giant said. I'll grind your bones to make my bread. Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She nibbled the zwieback that she always fed off, and when it was gone, she cut the giant's head off. Isabel met a troublesome doctor. He punched and he poked till he really shocked her. The doctor's talk was of coughs and chills, and the doctor's satchel bulged with pills. The doctor said unto Isabel, swallow this, it'll make you well. Isabel didn't worry. Isabel didn't scream or scurry. She took those pills from the pill concoctor, and Isabel calmly cured the doctor.
One of the things we think about, the problem for anybody who wants to write or read children's poetry, is that almost all the great children's poetry seems to have been written around 1911. And how we write more is a question. The Edwardians seem to find a vein of children's poetry that's been very hard to get out of. Now, there are more modern poets that I like a great deal, X.J. Kennedy and David McCord, who was a favorite of Robert Frost's, and Jack Prelutsky is another one I like. Shel Silverstein, I know, has a big audience. I've never been a big fan of his, but some of our other readers today are going to convince me that I'm wrong when they read some of it. But I want to go back to one of those earlier poems, one of those Edwardian poems, and ask ourselves sort of, why is it that they could do stuff that we can't? This is a poem by a man otherwise unknown named A.A. Milne. Maybe you have heard of him. And he wrote a number of poems. He just struck out on a vein and wrote a number of poems which also had a joke in them for adults, although even at that time, it would be difficult for many adults to get the trick of this one, which the joke of it for adults being that the lines are in the perfect hexameter of Ovid. As I say, there's a level of adult joke that even the Edwardians didn't get, and we probably don't either, and yet somehow those Latin long and short rhythms translated into English accents come out in only one of two ways, like comic verse or like children's verse. And this one is called Disobedience. Notice, by the way, Dana talked about a kind of subversive energy in children's poetry. Notice the subversion here. It's the mother who's disobeying the child in this poem rather than the other way around. And it goes quite famously, it opens, James, James, Morrison, Morrison, Weatherby, George Dupree. That, by the way, is a perfect hexameter for those of you with Latin. For the rest of us, it just bounces right along. Took great care of his mother, though he was only 3. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me. James, Morrison's mother put on a golden gown. James, Morrison's mother drove to the end of the town. James, Morrison's mother said to herself, said she, I can get right down to the end of the town and be back in time for tea. King John put up a notice, lost or stolen or strayed. James, Morrison's mother seems to have been mislaid. Last seen, wandering vaguely, quite of her own accord, she tried to get down to the end of the town. 40 shillings reward. James, Morrison, commonly known as Jim, told his other relations not to go blaming him. James said to his mother, Mother, he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town without consulting me. James, Morrison's mother hasn't been heard of since. King John said he was sorry, so did the Queen and Prince. King John, somebody told me, said to a man he knew, if people go down to the end of the town, well, what can anyone do? Now, very softly, J.M.M.W.G. Dupuy took great care of his though he was only 3. J said to his he said he, you must never go down to the end of the town if you don't go down with me.
I want to read a poem by Ogden Nash. Let me turn this on. I want to read a poem by Ogden Nash, too. This is a poem that my mother read to me when I was a little boy. I think she found it in the Saturday Evening Post. I can't figure out any other way a contemporary poem would have entered our working-class household in Hawthorne, California. And this poem, among its many virtues, has one of my favorite rhymes. I won't give you the whole rhyme, but it's the rhyme that rhymes with household. It's called The Tale of Custard the Dragon, which keeps my theme of fabulous animals going. Belinda lived in a little white house with a little black kitten and a little gray mouse and a little yellow dog and a little red wagon and a realio, trulio, little pet dragon. Now the name of the little black kitten was Ink, and the little gray mouse, she called her Blink. And the little yellow dog was sharp as mustard, but the dragon was a coward, and she called him Custard. Custard the dragon had big, sharp teeth, and spikes on top of him and scales underneath, mouth like a fireplace, chimney for a nose, and realio, trulio, daggers on his toes. Belinda was brave as a barrel full of bears, and Ink and Blink chased lions down the stairs. Mustard was brave as a tiger in rage, but Custard cried for a nice, safe cage. Belinda tickled him. She tickled him unmerciful. Ink, Blink, and Mustard, they rudely called him Percival. They all sat laughing in the little red wagon at the realio, trulio, cowardly dragon. Belinda giggled till it shook the house, and Blink said, "Week," which is giggling for a mouse. Ink and Mustard rudely asked his age, when Custard cried for a nice, safe cage. Suddenly they heard a nasty sound, and Mustard growled, and they all looked around. "Meouch," cried Ink. "Ooh," cried Belinda, for there was a pirate climbing in the window. Pistol in his left hand, pistol in his right, he held his teeth in his teeth, a cutlass sprice. His beard was black, one leg was wood. It was clear that the pirate meant no good. Belinda paled, and she cried, "Help, help!" But Mustard fled with a terrified yelp. Ink trickled down to the bottom of the household, and the little mouse, Blink, strategically mouseholed. But up jumped Custard, snorting like an engine, clashed his tail like irons in a dungeon. With a clatter and a clank and a jangling squirm, he went at the pirate like a robin at a worm. The pirate gaped at Belinda's dragon and gulped some grog from his pocket flagon. He fired 2 bullets, but they didn't hit, and Custard gobbled him every bit. Belinda embraced him, Mustard licked him. No one mourned his pirate victim. Ink and Blink and Glee did gyrate around the dragon that ate the pirate. Belinda still lives in her little white house with her little black kitten and her little gray mouse and her little yellow dog and her little red wagon and her realio, trulio, little pet dragon. Belinda is brave as a barrel full of bears, and Ink and Blink chase lions down the stairs. Mustard is brave as a tiger in a rage, but Custard keeps crying for a nice, safe cage.
Well, I'd hoped to be the one who would introduce the pitiless note to this session, ladies and gentlemen. But now that I've heard your crystal reading, I know what it would be like to hear Leo Strauss reading My Pet Goat. So it's probably too late for me to trash A.A. Milne in the unsentimental way I planned. I was brought up on Milne, one had to be. The House at Pooh Corner, to be succeeded by When We Were Very Young, and Now We Are 6. Of which I must say Jodie selected by far the best. But I remember the sense of liberation that came upon me when I read a parody that ended, "Hush, hush, nobody cares, Christopher Robin has fallen downstairs." And so it was when I was quite small myself that I seized upon Hillaire Belloc and his cautionary tales, and on whoever it was who wrote ruthless rhymes for heartless homes. I can do some of Belloc from memory, but I'm not going to try and do the main one. But for example, he wrote about Lord Finchley. Lord Finchley tried to mend the electric light himself. It struck him dead and serve him right. It is the business of the wealthy man to give employment to the artisan. That's Belloc in a gem-like form. And in the opening of one of his books for children, he says, speaking to them, and illustrating it beautifully with the cartoon of a fat old gent bending down to address the child, your little hands were made to take the better things and leave the worse ones. They also may be used to shake the massive paws of elder persons. But I now have to put on my glasses and actually read from Lord Lundy. It's a cautionary verse. Lord Lundy, the superscription says, who was too freely moved to tears and thereby ruined his political career. Lord Lundy, from his earliest years, was far too freely moved to tears. For instance, if his mother said, "Lundy, it's time to go to bed," he bellowed like a little Turk. Or if his father, Lord Dunkirk, said "Hi" in a commanding tone, "Hi, Lundy, leave the cat alone," Lord Lundy, letting go its tail, would raise so terrible a wail as moved his grandpapa the Duke to utter the severe rebuke, "When I, sir, was a little boy, an animal was not a toy." His father's eldest sister, who was married to a parvenu, confided to her husband, "Drat, the miserable peevish brat. Why don't they drown the little beast?" Suggestions which, to say the least, are not what we expect to hear from daughters of an English peer. His grandmamma, his mother's mother, who had some dignity or other, the garter or no matter what, I can't remember all the lot, said, "Oh, that I were brisk and spry, to give him that for which to cry." An empty wish, alas, for she was blind and nearly 93. This verse I can do. The dear old butler thought, but there, I really neither know nor care for what the dear old butler thought. In my opinion, butlers ought to know their place and not to play the old retainer. Night and day, I'm getting tired and so are you. We'll cut the poem into two. Second canto. It happened to Lord Lundy then, as happens to so many men towards the age of 26, they shoved him into politics, in which profession he commanded the income that his rank demanded. In turn as secretary for India, the colonies, and war. But very soon his friends began to doubt if he were quite the man. Thus, if a member rose to say, as members do from day to day, arising out of that reply, Lord Lundy would begin to cry. A hint at harmless little jobs would shake him with convulsive sobs. While as for revelations, these would simply bring him to his knees and leave him whimpering like a child. It drove his colleagues raving wild. They let him sink from post to post, from 1,500 at the most, to 8, and barely 6, and then to be curator of Big Ben. And finally there came a threat to oust him from the cabinet. The Duke, his aged grandsire, bore the shame till he could bear no more. He rallied his declining powers, summoned the youth to Brackley Towers, and bitterly addressed him thus: "Sir, you have disappointed us. We had intended you to be the next Prime Minister but 3. The stocks were sold, the press was squared, the middle class was quite prepared, but as it is, my patience fails. Go out and govern New South Wales." The aged grandsire groaned and died, and heavens how Lord Lundy cried.
Okay, let's have a show of hands. How many people in this room under the age of 12 are still awake? Ooh, okay, I'm gonna need...
their 12th year.
Put them to sleep.
I'm gonna need your help in reading this next poem by Mr. Jody Bottum. Okay, and when I do need it, I'll give a little wave of a hand. So pay attention and help me out, okay? I didn't hear you, what? I'll take that as a yes. This poem is called Bugs. I once took a ladybug home to tea, down by the root of a juniper tree, and the ladybug fell asleep. I once saw a tipsy, bumbling bee slurping the juice of a slow plum tree, and the bee buzzed, and the ladybug fell asleep. A stink bug, ew, crawled past my knee up at the top of a sycamore tree, and the stink bug squinched, squint, squint, and the bee buzzed, zirp, zirp, and the ladybug fell asleep. A fine fettle cricket sang happy and free under the bloom of an apricot tree, and the cricket croaked, cricket, cricket. And the stink bug squinched, squint, squint, and the bee buzzed, zirp, zirp, and the ladybug fell asleep.
You're supposed to help him out here. When the lady...
Not yet, I'll wave. A grasshopper hopped in the grass near me, slow as a hound by a dogwood tree, and the grasshopper moaned, and the cricket croaked, cricket, cricket, and the stink bug squinched, squint, squint, and the bee buzzed, zzz, zzz, and the ladybug fell asleep. I once knew a fly who decided to flee deep in the shade of an old oak tree, and the fly breezed, bzzz, bzzz, and the grasshopper moaned, and the cricket croaked, cricket, cricket, and the stink bug squinched, squint, squint, and the bee buzzed, zirp, zirp, and the ladybug fell asleep. I had no food for a hungry flea, leaving his friends in a lone pine tree, and the flea flew away in a huff. And the flea breezed, bzz, bzz, and the grasshopper moaned, and the cricket croaked, cricket, cricket, the stink bug squinched, squint, squint, and the bee buzzed, zip, zip, and the ladybug fell asleep. A centipede marched up, hop, 2, 3, crunching the shells from a chestnut tree, and the centipede drummed, titty-tum, and the flea flew away in a huff, and the fly breezed, bzz, bzz, and the grasshopper moaned, and the cricket croaked, cricket, cricket, the stink bug squinched, squinch, squinch, and the bee buzzed, and the ladybug fell asleep. A dragonfly promised he'd fly to sea high in the fronds of a tall palm tree, and the dragonfly whirled, and the centipede drummed, titty-tum, and the flea flew away in a huff, and the flea breezed, bzz, bzz, and the grasshopper moaned, and the cricket croaked, and the stink bug squinched, and the bee buzzed, and the ladybug fell to a deep, deep, down in a heap, no peep, sleep.
Picked up my sleep theme there. The thing about A. Milne and Ovid, we all knew that down at this side of the table, really. You know, Sandra Boynton was more influenced by Horace, actually. I could give a little disquisition on that, but I won't. Well, even though I was a neglectful poetic parent, my wife, Susan, actually did read the kids occasionally some decent poetry, and that was inspired, I think, by her mother, who read Susan and her sisters and brother poetry, and Louise Goldman Scheinberg, Susan's mother's favorite poem, was from Robert Louis Stevenson's Child's Garden of Verse, and it's called Where Go the Boats. Dark brown is the river, golden is the sand, it flows along forever with trees on either hand. Green leaves a-floating, castles of the foam, boats of mine a-boating, where will all come home? On goes the river and out past the mill, away down the valley, away down the hill, away down the river, 100 miles or more. Other little children shall bring my boats ashore.
I have here another Ogden Nash poem, which is really being read for the men on the panel who have children and may ever have been tempted to write about them, because this is the definitive word about that. It's called My Daddy. I have a funny daddy who goes in and out with me, and everything that baby does, my daddy's sure to see. And everything that baby says, my daddy's sure to tell. You must have read my daddy's verse. I hope he fries in hell.
What do you have to say to that, Jim?
I know. One uses one's children because when you're writing, anything will do for a topic, and they're always around. These are actually try a couple more here. These are a couple of my poems that, my new collection that, my new manuscript that use those same Latin rhythms that I was talking about with Milne to try and create children's verse. It's a cruel thing to do, I know, but I thought I'd give it a try. This first one is called My Family and Me, and it goes, my dad is a werewolf. Dogs bark and snarl at him in Hyde Park. His beard sprouts, his eyes spark. A full moon drives him mad. But Mom is a goblin, no toys escape the pitchfork she employs. Her pointy ears hate all noise. I must be very calm. My sister's a zombie. She seems to cause a lot of loud screams. Our neighbors all have bad dreams and wish that they had missed her. My brother now, well, who knows just what he is, but hair grows between his toes and past his nose his eyeballs watch each other. And me, I'll never be mistook for one of them, 'cause I snook a peek in the mirror and I look as right can be. No one is as right as me. This second, which has is sort of a pair, it has the same or similar rhythm. That's why I mentioned it. It's called Honey and Jam. What's your name? Carolyn, can you read, Carolyn? How old are you? 8. Come here, come help me. Okay? Okay, I'm gonna point to something. When I point to it, you read it. Okay, you ready? This is called Honey and Jam. Jane and Sue, Jill too, went to the store for honey. Jane complained, voice pained, Sue had just lost their money. Sadly, Jill, quite ill, said that it wasn't funny. This honeyless, moneyless mess, this moment of deepest distress, this day when tears and nameless fears seem to be finding...
What? But what?
But wait.
Wait.
On the ground, Sue found there was the missing money. With her cries, dark skies suddenly changed to sunny. Twirling curls, those girls ran in to buy their honey. This moneyful, honeyful time. This moment of laughter and rhyme. This day when glee for heroines 3 seems to be breaking.
Oh, no.
Oh, no. Through their hands, like sands, trickled the jar of honey. Down it crashed, glass smashed, wasting their hopes and money. There it lay, sad day, gooey and wrecked and runny. This honey gone, money gone plight, this moment of horrible blight, this time when doom and poisonous gloom seemed to be spreading.
But stop.
Jill explained, voice strained, something that seemed quite funny. Jam on bread, well spread, tastes even better than honey. Jam they had, so glad, making the world turn sunny. This morning begun with a boast, this day much better than most. When Jane and Sue and Jill too buttered and jammed
their toast.
I'm going to read a couple of very short poems by X.J. Kennedy, who's written 3 books about bad children who come to bad ends. The first is called Brats. The sequel was called More Brats, and the ultimate volume in this trilogy was called Drat Those Brats. I think they're very Bellocian in their tone, although a little shorter. And so you'll hear the sad stories of John, of Lars, of Randall, and Eloise. John, while swimming in the ocean, rubbed sharks back with suntan lotion. Now the sharks have skin of bronze in their bellies, namely John's. On his motorbike, Lars stands, roaring past us. Look, no hands. Soon, with vacant handlebars, back the bike roars. Look, no Lars. At the fireworks show, rash Randall, clinging to a Roman candle, took off, whoosh, across the dark. That lad, said Dad, will make his mark. And finally, campfire cooking Eloise fed a grizzly melted cheese to find out, did it like Welsh rarebit? Eloise was what the bear bit.
Impressive in a way, perhaps, that it only takes, what, 2.5 cycles of 6 adult readers before the theme becomes children, torture, murder, and cruelty. I don't know how many of you shared my love for the fables of Aesop when you were small. I liked them a lot, especially Androcles and the Lion. And I like the update, the one that, well, not the update, actually the parallel one that's across the Muslim world now, the stories of Nasruddin Hoxha, the Aesop of Turkey and Greece and Iran. But there is, there's an American-English version of the story of the Fox and the Raven. You remember the Fox and the Raven? The dumb raven that has the cheese and the fox that cheats the bird? Okay, which I think I can still summon from memory. If this fails, I'll be down to Limericks pretty soon. I warn C-SPAN now. But keep Aesop in mind, and here it is. A raven sat upon a tree, and not a word he spoke for. His beak contained a piece of brie, or maybe it was Roquefort. We'll make it any kind you please. At all events, it was a cheese. Beneath the tree's umbrageous limb, a hungry fox sat, smiling. He saw the raven watching him, spoke in tones beguiling. J'admire, quoth he, ton beau plumage. The which was simply persiflage. 2 things there are, no doubt you know, to which a fox is used. A rooster that is bound to crow, a crow that's bound to roost, and whichsoever he espies, he tells the most unblushing lies. Sweet fowl, he said, I understand you're more than merely natty. I hear you sing to beat the band, and Adelina Patty. Pray render with your golden tongue a bit from Götterdammerung. This subtle speech was aimed to please the bird, and it succeeded. He thought no crow in all the trees could sing as well as he did. In flattery, completely doused, he gave the jewel song from Faust. But gravitation's law, of course, as Isaac Newton showed it, exerted on the cheese its force, and elsewhere soon bestowed it. In fact, there is no need to tell what happened when to earth it fell. I blush to add that when the bird took in the situation, he uttered one emphatic word, unfit for publication. The fox was greatly startled, but he only sighed and answered, tut. The moral is, a fox is bound to be a shameless sinner. And also, when the cheese comes round, you know it's after dinner. But what is only known to few, the fox is after dinner too.
This next poem, I hesitated to bring in, and Jody said it was probably a good idea to bring it in. It's kind of a somber poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, who wrote it in 1880, one September day, and wrote to his good friend Robert Bridges, who I believe was the poet laureate at the time of England, yeah? That he was not very happy with it. He said it wasn't based on a real incident, but it has to do with mortality, and I think children understand something about that. Anyway, it goes something like this. Margaret, are you grieving over Golden Grove unleaving? Leaves like the things of man you with your fresh thoughts care for, can you? As the heart grows older, it'll come to such sights colder by and by, nor spare a sigh, though worlds of wanwood leaf meal lie. And yet you will weep and know why. Now, No matter, child, the name, sorrow's springs are the same. Nor mouth had known, nor mind expressed, what heart heard, ghost guessed. It is the blight that man was born for. It is Margaret you mourn for.
Stonyhurst.
I was actually going to read a poem from, an additional poem from A.A. Milne, but I'm so terrified of Christopher's, contempt and for such maudlin sentimentality. I think I'll pass on that and move to the safe refuge of T.S. Eliot, who is that okay with you? He's okay. He's mean-spirited enough, I think, you know.
Especially if it's feline.
Right, it is feline, right. Mildly anti-Semitic, like Hillaire Belloc, so that's kind of a sub-theme of this panel, you know, right? The early 20th century oddball British poets. So, and this is appropriate because yeah, American in this case, yeah, well, quasi-British, right? That's it.
Belloc was French.
This is appropriate, I think, because it's Macavity, the Mystery Cat, by T.S. Eliot, and we had a cat, have a cat, and had the cat through most of our kids growing up. We now have a dog, I should hasten to add as well, out of equal treatment for the dog. But he only came to replace one of the kids when she went to college, whereas the cat actually was there with the kids. And we like mysteries, so it's an appropriate poem. Macavity, the Mystery Cat. Macavity's a mystery cat. He's called the Hidden Paw, for he's the master criminal who can defy the law. He's the bafflement of Scotland Yard, the flying squad's despair. For when they reach the scene of the crime, Macavity's not there. Macavity, Macavity, there's no one like Macavity. He's broken every human law. He breaks the law of gravity. His powers of levitation would make a faker stare. And when you reach the scene of crime, Macavity's not there. You may seek him in the basement, you may look up in the air, but I tell you once and once again, Macavity's not there. Macavity's a ginger cat. He's very tall and thin. You'd know him if you saw him, for his eyes are sunken in. His brow is deeply lined with thought. His head is highly domed. His coat is dusty from neglect. His whiskers are uncombed. He sways his head from side to side with movements like a snake. And when you think he's half asleep, he's always wide awake. Macavity, Macavity, there's no one like Macavity, for he's a fiend in feline shape, a monster of depravity. You may meet him in a by-street, you may see him in the square, but when a crime's discovered, then Macavity's not there. He's outwardly respectable. They say he cheats at cards. And his footprints are not found in any file of Scotland Yards. And when the larder's looted, or the jewel case is rifled, or when the milk is missing, or another peak's been stifled, or the greenhouse glass is broken, and the trellis past repair, aye, there's the wonder of the thing. Macavity's not there. And when the Foreign Office finds a treaty's gone astray, or the Admiralty lose some plans and drawings, by the way, there may be a scrap of paper in the hall or on the stair, but it's useless to investigate. Macavity's not there. And when the loss has been disclosed, the Secret Service says, it must have been Macavity, but he's a mile away. You'll be sure to find him resting, or a licking of his thumbs, or engaged in doing complicated long division sums. Macavity, Macavity, there's no one like Macavity. There never was a cat of such deceitfulness and suavity. He always has an alibi, and one or two to spare. At whatever time the deed took place, Macavity wasn't there. And they say that all the cats whose wicked deeds are widely known, I might mention Mungo Jerry, I might mention Griddlebone, are nothing more than agents for the cat who all the time just controls their operations, the Napoleon of crime.
Jody and Dana's vivid, gruesome offerings suggest one answer to what it is children want out of poetry, and it is an answer summarized perfectly by this last poem I'll read by Ogden Nash, which happens to be Chris DeMuth's favorite. So Chris, this one's for you. Don't Cry, Darling, It's Blood All Right is the title. Whenever poets want to give you the idea that something is particularly meek and mild, they compare it to a child, thereby proving that though poets with poetry may be rife, they don't know the facts of life. If of compassion you desire either a tittle or a jot, don't try and get it from a tot. Hard-boiled, sophisticated adults like me and you may enjoy ourselves thoroughly with Little Women and Winnie the Pooh, but innocent infants these titles from their reading course eliminate as soon as they discover that it was honey and nuts and mashed potatoes instead of human flesh that Winnie the Pooh and Little Women ate. Innocent infants have no use for fables about rabbits or donkeys or tortoises or porpoises. What they want is something with plenty of well-mutilated corpuses. Not on legends of how the rose came to be a rose instead of a petunia is their fancy fed, but on the inside story of how somebody's bones got ground up to make somebody else's bread. They'll go to sleep listening to the story of the little beggar maid who got to be queen by being kind to the bees and the birds, but they're all eyes and ears the minute they suspect a wolf or a giant is going to tear some poor woodcutter into quarters or thirds. It really doesn't take much to fill their cup. All they want for is somebody to be eaten up. Therefore, I say unto you, all you poets who are so crazy about meek and mild little children and their angelic air, if you are sincere and really want to please them, why, just go out and get yourselves devoured by a bear.
Hearing Tim read Spring and Fall to a Young Child reminds me of there is a sadness in children's poetry. I mean, you know, some of the poems that children like, there's a reason that some of Edgar Allan Poe's poetry, for instance, Annabel Lee and the rest of it, have a kind of resonance. I think trying to read your children only bouncy, happy poetry is a little like feeding them Ritalin. And I offer this to Mary, who's just written the book about how we shouldn't be doing that. It seems to me, of course, you can go overboard. Kenneth Graham, who wrote The Wind in the Willows, once edited an anthology of Victorian children's verse in which he said that there was enough Victorian children's verse about funerals that one could make a nice little anthology of funerary verse for the education of children, and that he decided, though, he wasn't going to do that. But still, there is a harder edge that children's poetry can have. This is not the best of them. This is a poem of mine that strikes me as perhaps the most anti-school thing I've ever written. It's called My Fall, and it goes, "School's neat, take your seat, that's what teachers said. Some fools like rules, I replied instead. Hauled out, parents shout, world turn gray and slow, please don't, I won't, and back to school I go. But the sky's not fooled, and the wind unschooled whispers through the trees that the hills have seats where the air tastes sweet and long grass sways with the breeze, and the leaves need lots of watching, tumbling as they fall, and from the south the wild geese look back as if to call, come, come, come with us, dwindling with the fall, fading as they call. School's fine, stand in line, teacher says next day. I do, it's true, listen and obey. New pens, new friends, timesing 6 by 4, new days, new ways as teacher shuts the door. But the unpenned wind in the open sky writes with whispered sound of forgotten joys and friendless toys that played along the ground. And the trees are always waiting as light begins to fall, and high above the bright leaves the wild geese still call, come, come, come with us, dwindling with the fall, fading as they call. I'm
going to also read a sort of an elegiac poem. I mean, I think having dispatched so many children already on this panel,
We should have their funerals.
yeah, the least we can do is have an elegy. This is also by X.J. Kennedy, who told me that he had once, a little girl who had lived down the street died, and he had never met her, but he had seen her in the front yard skipping rope. Little elegy for a child who skipped rope. Here lies resting, out of breath, out of turns, Elizabeth, whose quick silver toes, not quite, cleared the whirring edge of night. Earth, whose circles round us skims, till it catch the lightest limbs. Shelter now, Elizabeth, and for her sake, trip up death.
There comes a time, I think especially if you're male and if you're English, where they'll give you poetry in a sense to build character. It'll be about history and it'll be about heroism and about fortitude. George Orwell makes the observation that some of this poetry is very good, bad poetry, and some of it's very bad, good poetry. The test of how to separate the two is whether or not it has the faculty of recurring to the mind at crucial moments. Henry Newbolt would be an example with Drake's drum. Drake is in his hammock and 1,000 miles away. Captain, art thou sleeping there below? Slung between the round shot in Nombre Dios Bay, but dreaming all the time of Plymouth Hoe. Or the sand of the desert is sodden red. This is his Vitae Lampada. Red with the blood of a square that broke. The Gatling's jammed, the colonel's dead. The regiment choked and blinded with smoke. The river of death has burst its banks, and England's far, and honour and name. But the voice of a schoolboy rallies the ranks. Play up, and play the game. You either find that pathetic or pathetic or stirring, perhaps according to taste and the times. But there's one poem that absolutely exemplifies this ethos, and which for some reason never dies, I think for many good reasons, is reborn in all generations, and it's Kipling's If, which I'll close on if I may. If you can keep your head when all about you are losing theirs and blaming it on you, if you can trust yourself when all men doubt you, but make allowance for their doubting too, if you can wait and not be tired by waiting, or being lied about, don't deal in lies, or being hated, don't give way to hating, and yet don't look too good, nor talk too wise, if you can dream and not make dreams your master, if you can think and not make thoughts your aim, if you can meet with triumph and disaster and treat these two impostors just the same, if you can bear to hear the truth you've spoken, twisted by knaves to make a trap for fools, or watch the things you gave your life to broken, and stoop and build them up with worn-out tools. If you can make one heap of all your winnings and risk it on one turn of pitch and toss and lose, and start again at your beginnings and never breathe a word about your loss, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on, well, there is nothing in you except the will that says, hold on, hold on. If you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, and all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute with 60 seconds worth of distance run, yours is the world, and everything that's in it. And what is more, you'll be a man, my son. Yeah.
Now, poetry is obviously not just something that adults do to read to children, but children sometimes can do to read to each other or back to adults. How many people in this room have heard of Mattie Stepanek? Anybody? Any of the kids? Mattie was from just outside the district in Maryland, and had a unique way of celebrating the beauty, the joy, the enchantment he found in his life, even though he struggled with a very difficult disease. And Mattie passed from us into that great mystery toward which he had such profound hope this past year, I believe, and he was 11 years old. So I'd like to read a couple of poems that he wrote, if I may. Shh. I smell something. It smells like a noise. Like a turtle noise. Yes, that's what it is. It's a turtle noise. And it's wonderful because, well, turtles live inside of seashells. Would you like to live in a seashell? They would smell like a turtle noise, but I think it'd be wonderful. Let's see here. This one is called Important Things. When I grow up, I think maybe I'll be a snowman because when it snows outside, I'll already be cold and like it. And children will play with me and laugh and sing and dance all around me. And those are important things to have happen when you grow up. And lastly, this one is called Leaf for a Day. Today I think I'll be a tree, or perhaps a leaf on the branch of a tree. I will feel the gentle breeze, and then I will plip off my branch and my tree and float in the wind. I will go back and forth on the breeze all the way down to the ground. And after I rest and say hello to the grass and dirt and bugs, I will call to the wind, come and take me to visit my other leaf friends and on all the other trees, please. And the gentle breeze will come and pick me up so that I can jump and dance with all of the other tree stars and tree flowers that God gave the world. What a special idea to be today.
I thought I might close actually like Christopher with a sort of edifying young boy's poem. I think this was my favorite poem perhaps when I was in junior high school or sometime like that. This is Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. It's some Tennyson. You have to have one Kipling and one Tennyson in such a reading, I suppose. I think it's also relevant to today, since those of us who worry that Secretary Rumsfeld didn't send enough troops to Iraq has a certain. I just want to make one public policy reference here for Chris Demuth's sake, you know. But I'm sure we will not meet the American troops there, and our Iraqi friends will not meet the same sad end as the British in Crimea. So this is Tennyson's Charge of the Light Brigade. Half a league, half a league, half a league onward, all in the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade, charge for the guns, he said. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Forward the Light Brigade. Was there a man dismayed? Not though the soldiers knew, somewhat had blundered. Theirs not to make reply, theirs not to reason why, theirs but to do and die. Into the valley of death rode the 600. Cannon to the right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon in front of them volleyed and thundered. Stormed at with shot and shell, boldly they rode, and well into the jaws of death, into the mouth of hell, rode the 600. Flashed all their sabers bare, flashed as they turned in air, sabering the gunners there, charging an army, while all the world wondered. Plunged in the battery smoke, right through the line they broke, Cossack and Russian reeled from the saber stroke, shattered and sundered. Then they rode back, but not the 600. Cannon to right of them, cannon to left of them, cannon behind them volleyed and thundered, stormed at with shot and shell, while horse and hero fell. They that had fought so well came through the jaws of death, back from the mouth of hell, all that was left of them, left of 600. When can their glory fade? Oh, the wild charge they made, all the world wondered. Honor the charge they made, honor the Light Brigade, noble 600.
Well, Well, now that even Bill Crystal has deserted me as an ally, I finally ascertained my real purpose on the panel, which is to relentlessly anchor the lowbrow wing of this group. You'll notice they put it on the far right. I would like to read, in defense of Shel Silverstein, one Shel Silverstein poem. This is for the kids in the room, and it's a perfect example of what Ogden Nash was talking about so far as what kids look for in poetry. It's called Screamin' Millie, and it's been a big hit in my house. Millie McDevitt screamed a scream so loud it made her eyebrows steam. She screamed so loud her jawbone broke. Her tongue caught fire, her nostrils smoked. Her eyeballs boiled and then popped out. Her ears flew north, her nose went south. Her teeth flew out, her voice was wrecked. Her head went sailing off her neck. Over the hillside, crossed the stream, into the skies it chased the scream. And that's what happened to Millie McDevitt. At least I hope all you screamers believe it.
Well, what do you want here to close? Do you want something bouncy or do you want something sad? Bouncy? Okay. There's a poet that I like a lot named David McCord, who never managed to write successful adult verse, really. But as children's verse, there's something about, you can see this in the children's verse that Kipling writes, that others of the poets that we've read, including Mill. There's some kind of metrical genius in certain children's writers that doesn't translate well into adult poetry and yet just has perfect bounces. These are a couple little poems from David McCord. This one's called Isabel Jones and Carryl Lee. Isabel Jones and Carryl Lee lived on butter and bread and tea, and as to this they would both agree. Isabel, Carryl, Jones, and Lee. Isabel said, well, prunes have stones, they aren't a promising food for Jones. Carryl said, well, as for me, tripe is a terrible thing for Lee. There's not a dish or fowl or fish for which we wish, said I and C, and that is why until we die we'll eat no pie, nor beg nor buy, but butter and bread and a trace of tea. Signed Isabel, Carryl, Jones, and Lee. He also has these short little chants for children that strike me as perfect, although I had trouble selling them to some of the children to whom I read them. But I'll try it on this. This one's called The Pickety Fence, and he's trying to make the poem itself sound like the noise you would make if you ran a stick down a picket fence. And it goes, the pickety fence, give it a lick, it's a pickety fence, give it a lick, it's a clickety fence, give it a lick, it's a lickety fence, give it a lick with a rickety stick, pickety, 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 pick. And finally, to end it here this evening, I want to read one more chant from him, which is called Every Time I Climb a Tree. And it goes, every time I climb a tree, every time I climb a tree, every time I climb a tree, I scrape a leg or skin a knee, and every time I climb a tree, I find some ants or dodge a bee and get the ants all over me. And every time I climb a tree, where have you been, they say to me. But don't they know that I am free every time I climb a tree? I like it best to spot a nest that has an egg or maybe three, and then I skin the other leg. But every time I climb a tree, I see a lot of things to see. Swallows, rooftops, and TV, and all the fields and farms there be every time I climb a tree. Though climbing may be good for ants, it isn't awfully good for pants, but still it's pretty good for me. Every time I climb a tree. We want to thank you all for coming and thank all of our readers here. Dana Gioia, Christopher Hitchens, Tim Kelleher, Bill Crystal, and Mary Eberstadt. Thank you all for coming, and Michael Novak, thank you for having us.
Trying to find. I couldn't have James Morrison.
Stop.
Hillaire.
Hi, how are you?
Vanessa.
What do you think?
It's great. When does it come out?
This panel was hosted by the American Enterprise Institute, on the web at aei.org.
In exit surveys, the #1 issue on voters' minds in the 2004 election was moral values. Neuroscientist Sam Harris takes a critical look at the role of religion in public life in his new book, The End of Faith, Religion, Terror, and the Future of Reason. Church and State, Sunday at 10:30 a.m. Eastern, here on Book TV. He's best known for co-authoring the controversial book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And live this Sunday at noon Eastern, it's your chance to talk to Charles Murray on Book TV's In Depth. Mr. Murray, the author of 8 books and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, has written about welfare reform in Losing Ground, American Social Policy 1950 to 1980, on what it means to be a libertarian, and his latest, Human Accomplishment, the Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950. Charles Murray, In Depth, live this Sunday at...
A fact which publishers have never forgotten, which is it's the parents who buy the books, not the children. But there's also a deeper reason, maybe, for why so much children's poetry wants to have a second level that appeals to adults. Anyway, this poem of mine is called Reading by Osmosis. And it's for my many friends, both young and old, who know the names of many, many more authors and books than they've ever actually read. And it's called Reading by Osmosis, and it goes, well, Mark Twain, Hart Crane, and Ursula K. Le Guin. We've mastered their books with a difficult trick. We've read them outside in. Percy B. Shelley and Machiavelli and Norman Vincent Peale. We've never tried opening one of their books. We know them by their feel. Does reading seem boring? Does reading seem hard? Does reading seem too ferocious? Then pick up a book and just give it a twirl. You'll learn it by osmosis, because osmosis is the mostest. Osmosis is the best. Osmosis is the closest thing to reading without rest. Osmosis means absorbing. Osmosis means so much. Osmosis means we're soaking up the books we barely touch. Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Henry David Thoreau, and Daniel Defoe, and Jacques Rousseau, and hundreds of others we know. We bobble, bounce, and throw them. We never even look. Osmosis means we know them without opening a book. You know, my sister osmoted The Mill on the Floss. A marvelous book, and gave us a gloss concerning a man named John Stuart Mill with terrible teeth that made him quite ill. Why, oh why, wouldn't he floss? My brother osmoted The Lord of the Rings, a story of insects with thousands of wings. Or was that a book called Lord of the Flies? Oh, well, we're getting wise by learning the things that osmosis now brings. We'll juggle the books Little Women and Men, they're all about dwarves in a mountainy den, and throw in a copy of Watership Down, concerning a boat and some sailors who drown, and then we'll run to the bookstore again. But first, let's have a word from Dr. Derzena, who comes here today all the way from Vienna to teach us the meaning of difficult things. Ach, well, now we begin. Osmosis, this is meaning, that when two things are leaning, the one into the other tries to sneak. The liquid on the right, through membranes overnight, will to the left most definitely leak. While coming here I sat, on dictionaries fought, and learned all this by writing on the book. But if...
waves of thunderous applause. Let me ask one favor, and that is we're going to be having a book signing out in the front hall at the end of this, and I'd like to ask everyone to stay in the room until Ambassador Ross has had the chance to leave and get in position at the table where books will be available for purchase, and he will be glad to sign. Dennis Ross, thank you so much for your extraordinary contribution.
Thank you. Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, class is dismissed.
You're too kind.
We're going to have to ask for lunch.
Yes.
Thank you so much for that.
I got a lot more, but I didn't want to count.
It's all
Four veteran TV reporters talk about covering the assassination of John F. Kennedy, as told in their book, When the News Went Live, Dallas, 1963. See it tonight at 8 Eastern on C-SPAN 2.
He's best known for co-authoring the controversial book, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. And live this Sunday at noon Eastern, it's your chance to talk to Charles Murray on Book TV's In Depth. Mr. Murray, the author of 8 books and a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, has written about welfare reform in Losing Ground, American Social Policy, 1950 to 1980, on what it means to be a libertarian, and his latest, Human Accomplishment, the Pursuit of Excellence in the Arts and Sciences, 800 BC to 1950. Charles Murray, In Depth, live this Sunday at noon Eastern on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
If you have neurosis, mein Genius ist Hypnosis. You will mine eyes most deeply into look. Neurosis, hypnosis, psychosis, meiosis, lovely words in their way. Cirrhosis, necrosis, and also thrombosis, pleasing but harder to say. And atrocious prognosis of misdiagnosis for aches of precocious sclerosis. But words will find their apotheosis remains the great osmosis we boast. We boast. Osmosis is the most phenomenal way to read today while eating jam and toast. We shout, we plead, osmosis we will need for playing jacks and munching snacks and dancing while we read. So, Rebecca West and Edgar Guest. We'll never be certain which one is the best. Christopher Smart and Jean-Paul Sartre, just think of the wonders they have to impart. Poets of genius like Julia Moore and William McGonagall call for a roar. William Shakespeare, Edward de Vere. The difference isn't entirely clear. Somerset Maugham and L. Frank Baum, Josiah Royce and James Joyce, John Bunyan and Damon Runyon, Graham Greene and Molly Keane, Tom Paine and Ed McBain, Ring Lardner and John Gardner, C.P. Snow and Arthur Rimbaud, and hundreds of others we know, because osmosis is the mostest. Osmosis is the best. Osmosis is the closest thing to reading without rest. Osmosis means absorbing. Osmosis means so much. Osmosis means we're soaking up the books we barely touch. We hold them to our noses. We brush them with our clothes. We're learning by osmosis when we tap them with our toes. We pile them on the table. We slide them on the floor. We stack them into stairways and we climb up for some more. We bobble, bounce, and throw them. We never even look. Osmosis means we know them without opening a book.
Well, since Jody recited a poem that danced, I'll do one that tells a story. It seems to me that people that really love poetry almost always learn to love poetry as children. And there's something about the experience of actually hearing a poem before you can read a poem on a page, which I think is much closer to what the experience of poetry really is, which is about speech raised to a level that it's memorable and expressive. This is a poem that probably most of you don't know. It's by a very famous poet, A.E. Housman. And he wrote poems in letters that he sent to his nephew and his niece that were never included in his collected poems, but they're rather good. This one also has something I think that's very important for
that I put together a panel of people here in Washington to read their favorites and to natter a little bit about what children's poetry is and what it's for and what we should be looking for in it. Now, you have to understand the nation's capital is famous for many things, but comic children's poetry really isn't one of them. In fact, poetry at all isn't the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Washington, D.C., although the comic children part might. Anyway, there were no obvious choices here in town, so I asked the next 6 people to whom I happen to owe an email to join me today and read and talk a little bit about children's verse, and because God really does look out for idiots like me, we ended up with this unbelievable panel of people. My name is Joseph Bottum, and I'm the literary editor of the Weekly Standard and poetry editor of a magazine up in New York called First Things. Our friend Christopher Buckley, who was supposed to be here today, was unfortunately called away, but we still have Dana Gioia, who's the chairman of the National Endowment for the Arts and a celebrated poet and critic, whose latest volume is Disappearing Ink, right? Poetry at the end of the print culture. Our second, we have Christopher Hitchens, a widely published essayist, columnist for Vanity Fair, and the Atlantic Monthly, and everywhere else, and author most recently of Love, Poverty, and War, Journeys and Essays. Next we have Tim Kelleher, who's an actor, writer, and director in Los Angeles and New York, whose film credits include the role of Ted Sorensen in Roger Donaldson's movie 13 Days, and perhaps more to the point, the voice of Raphael in the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. We have William Crystal, my boss, the editor of the Weekly Standard, and a well-known political commentator for national television, writer everywhere. And finally, Mary Eberstadt, who's a consulting editor to the magazine Policy Review and author of the phenomenal new book, Home Alone America, The Hidden Toll of Daycare, Behavioral Drugs, and Other Parent Substitutes. Now, I'm going to start us off with a poem from my new manuscript because, well, mostly because I set up this panel and it's mine, all mine. No, but also because one of the things that we can talk about a little when we natter here today is how much of children's poetry is not for children at all. Or maybe what I mean is that a lot of children's poems run on 2 levels at the same time. There's the bounce, the tum, ti-da-tum, ti-da-tum, and the speed and the nonsense that children love. And at the same time, there's a joke in them for adults. Now, maybe this has to do, or this has to be so because you need to get parents actually to read those poems to the children. You should always remember the fact that publishers have never...
Sunday on Afterwards, Essie Mae Washington Williams on her Dear Senator, a memoir by the daughter of Strom Thurmond. Our guest interviewer is Tennessee Congressman Harold Ford Jr. Afterwards, every Sunday at 6 and 9 p.m. Eastern, on Book TV, on C-SPAN 2.
Now Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Every weekend, we bring you 48 hours of nonfiction books, history, biography, and public affairs, Saturday morning at 8 through Monday morning at 8 a.m. Eastern.
Now a panel on poetry for children with the Weekly Standard's Joseph Bottum and William Crystal, National Endowment for the Arts Chairman Dana Gioia, Vanity Fair columnist Christopher Hitchens, and author Mary Eberstadt. It's an hour 20 minutes.
Welcome. How are you all? Great to see you. My name is Michael Novak. I'm the George Frederick Jewett Chair here at AEI, and I'm privileged to welcome you for, I don't know, the 8th or 9th or 10th of our little cultural series. These are not official events of AEI, but the President does allow us to use the rooms and put them on, and we finance it ourselves, so our sponsors needn't worry that we're not using They're great contributions for non-public policy matters. But we are using them for matters more important than public policy. I'm really thrilled and honored that Jody Bottum agreed to put together this stellar panel for a reading of children's poetry so that we could invite the next generation and the next generation to be here with us and enjoy this evening. I'll turn it over to Jody for the introductions, and I think we're going to have a really, really good time. Jody, please. Thanks.
Today's program came about because writers will do anything, absolutely anything, to avoid keeping a promise. Last summer, I took an advance to write a new book on, thanks. I took an advance to write a new book on the state of Catholicism in America. So naturally, I had to find something else to do and some way of avoiding actually doing that. And the best thing I could come up with was to spend the next 3 or 4 months writing some children's poems. And when I mentioned to our friend Michael Novak that my new manuscript was children's poetry, he suggested